The moment his hand struck her shoulder, pushing her aside like she was nothing more than an obstacle, time stopped, and then everyone in the corridor saw the badge that would change everything he thought he knew about the woman who'd tried to save his daughter's life. Welcome back, beautiful souls. Hit subscribe and tell me where you're watching from, because tomorrow's story will touch your heart in ways you never expected. Tonight, a grieving father, a brilliant surgeon, and a moment of reckoning that changes two lives forever. Let's begin. The fluorescent lights of St. Mary's Hospital buzzed overhead like angry wasps as Jonathan Reed's Italian leather shoes clicked against the sterile linoleum with military precision. His Armani suit, perfectly pressed despite the early morning hour, couldn't hide the tension radiating from his shoulders or the way his jaw clenched with each stride. The folder in his hand, thick with legal documents that could make or break the pharmaceutical merger he'd spent 2 years orchestrating, felt heavier than it should. "Third floor, conference room B," he muttered to himself, checking his Rolex for the 5th time in 3 minutes. 7:47 a.m. The meeting with the hospital board was supposed to start at 8 sharp, and Jonathan Reed was never late. Never. Punctuality was power, his father had drilled into him, and power was the only thing that mattered in a world that took everything else away. His phone buzzed against his chest. Another message from his assistant, board members asking about delays. Dr. Martinez specifically mentioned the morning schedule conflicts. Jonathan's grip tightened on the folder. 2 years of work, countless sleepless nights, and the chance to finally prove himself worthy of the Reed family name, all hanging in the balance of this single meeting. The irony wasn't lost on him that he was fighting to save a company built on healing, when healing was the one thing that had always remained just out of his reach. What do you think drives someone to push so hard for success? Have you ever wondered if perfectionism might be masking something deeper? Drop your thoughts below. I'd love to hear your perspective. Meanwhile, 3 floors down in the surgical wing, Dr. Naomi Williams moved through the preoperative bay with the quiet grace of someone who understood that every second could mean the difference between life and death. Her scrubs, a soft mint green that complemented her dark skin, were pristine despite having been on her feet since 4 a.m. The surgical cap covering her natural hair couldn't hide the intelligence in her dark eyes or the way she commanded respect without saying a word. "Mrs. Patterson's vitals look good," she told the young resident trailing behind her, his notepad at the ready. "But I want another CBC before we proceed. Her hemoglobin was borderline yesterday." "Yes, Dr. Williams, should I also?" "Already ordered it." Her voice carried the authority of someone who'd spent 15 years saving lives and losing pieces of herself in the process. "And call down to radiology. I want those scans from last night pulled up before I scrub in." The resident nodded, scurrying away to fulfill her requests. Naomi paused at the surgical board, her eyes scanning the morning schedule with practiced efficiency. 3 operations before noon, each one carrying its own weight of responsibility, its own family waiting in anguish for news. Her fingers unconsciously touched the badge clipped to her chest, the one that identified her as Chief of Cardiovascular Surgery, the youngest person and only Black woman to ever hold the position at St. Mary. It should have felt like victory. Instead, it felt like a target she carried everywhere, a reminder that she had to be twice as good to get half as far, and that even then some people would never see past the color of her skin to the skill in her hands. The badge bore her full credentials: Dr. Naomi A. Williams, Maryland, Ph.D., Chief of Cardiovascular Surgery, St. Mary's Hospital. Below that, in smaller print, were the certifications that had taken her through Harvard Medical School, Johns Hopkins residency, and the fellowship at Mayo Clinic that had brought her here 5 years ago. What it didn't show was the cost of each achievement, the relationships sacrificed, the family lost, the part of herself she'd buried so deep she sometimes forgot it existed. A soft chime from the elevator bank echoed through the corridor, and Naomi glanced up to see the morning shift change beginning. Nurses, residents, and attending physicians moved with purposeful urgency, each carrying their own burdens and hopes into another day of fighting death and celebrating life. She thought of Mrs. Patterson upstairs, a 63-year-old grandmother whose triple bypass would either give her 10 more years to spoil her grandchildren or become another name on the list of battles Naomi couldn't win. The weight of that responsibility settled on her shoulders like a familiar coat, heavy but one she'd learned to wear with dignity. "Dr. Williams?" A young nurse approached hesitantly. "Mrs. Patterson's daughter is asking if she can see you before the surgery. She has some questions about the recovery process." Naomi nodded, checking her watch. She had 15 minutes before her first surgery, enough time to provide the reassurance that families needed almost as much as the medical intervention itself. It was this part of the job, the human connection, the ability to bring hope to the hopeless, that had driven her through medical school when the textbooks felt impossible and the prejudice felt insurmountable. As she walked toward the family consultation room, her mind briefly wandered to the life she might have had if things had been different. If the accident 7 years ago hadn't taken everything she'd held dear, leaving her with nothing but her career and a heart too scared to risk loving again. If she hadn't learned that sometimes the very hands meant to heal could also destroy everything they touched. But those thoughts were dangerous territory, and Dr. Naomi Williams had learned long ago that survival meant focusing on what she could control: the precision of her incisions, the steadiness of her hands, and the wall around her heart that kept her safe from feeling too much. The elevator chimed again, and she could hear hurried footsteps in the corridor above, someone running late, someone whose urgency would soon collide with her carefully ordered world in ways neither of them could possibly imagine. The collision happened at exactly 7:52 a.m., at the intersection of the main corridor and the surgical wing, a crossroads that would alter 2 lives forever. Jonathan had taken the stairs 3 at a time, his breath coming in controlled bursts as he reached the 3rd floor. The conference room was just around the corner, but the hallway had suddenly become crowded with what looked like a shift change. Nurses, orderlies, and medical staff moved in clusters, their conversations creating a low hum that felt like static against his already frayed nerves. His phone buzzed again. "Dr. Martinez says if you're not here in 5 minutes, they're starting without you." "Excuse me," Jonathan called out, trying to navigate through the crowd. "Excuse me, I need to get through." But the medical staff were deep in their handoff discussions, patient updates, medication schedules, critical care transfers, life and death conversations that couldn't be rushed, even for a man in an expensive suit who clearly thought his time was more valuable than theirs. Jonathan's frustration mounted with each second. He could see the conference room door just 30 feet away, could practically hear the board members questioning his commitment, his worthiness. The Reed name had opened doors for him his entire life, but it had also created expectations that felt like chains around his chest. That's when he saw her. Dr. Naomi Williams stood in the center of what appeared to be a medical consultation, her back to him as she spoke quietly with 2 nurses about patient care protocols. She moved with an unhurried confidence that seemed to ignore the urgency crackling through his veins. Her dark hands gestured gracefully as she explained something about post-operative monitoring, completely oblivious to the businessman whose world was crumbling with each passing second. "Excuse me," Jonathan said, louder this time, his voice carrying the sharp edge of privilege and impatience. "I need to get through here." Naomi glanced over her shoulder, taking in the expensive suit and the entitled posture. She'd seen his type before, men who thought their money gave them the right to interrupt medical discussions, who believed their business was more important than the lives she held in her hands every day. "Sir, we're conducting patient consultations here," she said calmly, turning back to her conversation. "There's another corridor." "I don't have time for another corridor." Jonathan's voice rose, drawing stares from nearby staff. "I have a meeting that started 3 minutes ago." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Naomi slowly turned to face him fully, her dark eyes meeting his blue ones with the steady gaze of someone who'd faced down much worse than an impatient businessman. "Sir, this is a hospital," she said, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone used to making life and death decisions. "Medical consultations take priority over business meetings. I'm sure you can understand that." But Jonathan couldn't understand anything beyond the ticking clock in his head, the sound of his father's voice reminding him that Reed men didn't make excuses, they made things happen. The pharmaceutical merger, the board meeting, the chance to finally prove himself, it all crystallized into this single moment where a woman was standing between him and everything he'd worked for. "Look, I don't know who you think you are," Jonathan said, stepping closer, his folder clutched so tightly his knuckles had turned white, "but some of us have actual important business to conduct here." The conversation around them began to die as other medical staff became aware of the tension building in their midst. Naomi felt the familiar tightening in her chest, the same feeling she'd experienced countless times when her qualifications were questioned, when her authority was challenged simply because she didn't look like what people expected a chief surgeon to look like. "I know exactly who I am," Naomi replied, her voice remaining steady despite the anger beginning to simmer beneath the surface, "and I know that in this hospital patient care comes first. Always." Jonathan's phone buzzed again, and something inside him snapped. 7 years of grief, 2 years of fighting for this deal, a lifetime of trying to live up to impossible expectations, it all coalesced into a moment of rage that would haunt him forever. "Get out of my way," he said, and before his conscious mind could stop him, before he could think about consequences or decency, or the kind of man his daughter would have wanted him to be, Jonathan Reed placed his hand on Dr. Naomi Williams' shoulder and pushed. It wasn't violent, it wasn't meant to hurt, but it was dismissive, entitled, and utterly devastating in its casual assumption that he had the right to move her aside like an obstacle. The push sent Naomi stumbling backward 2 steps, her balance momentarily lost, her professional composure shattered. For a split second, she was transported back 7 years, to another hospital corridor, to another moment when someone's impatience had cost her everything she'd ever loved. The hallway fell completely silent. Every conversation stopped. Every movement ceased. Doctors, nurses, orderlies, and patients, everyone within 30 feet, turned to stare at the well-dressed white man who had just physically pushed a black woman in the middle of a hospital corridor. But it was what happened next that turned silence into shock, that transformed a moment of casual prejudice into something that would echo through both their lives forever. Naomi straightened herself, her hands automatically smoothing her scrubs with the practiced dignity of someone who'd learned to maintain composure under any circumstances. As she did, the badge clipped to her chest caught the fluorescent light, its gold lettering suddenly visible to everyone in the corridor. Dr. Naomi A. Williams, Maryland, Ph.D., Chief of Cardiovascular Surgery, St. Mary's Hospital. Jonathan's eyes fell on the badge, and the world tilted on its axis. Chief of Cardiovascular Surgery. The same department that had operated on his daughter 7 years ago, the same department where a surgeon had spent 6 hours trying to repair the damage from a drunk driver's impact, where someone had fought to save 8-year-old Emma Reed's life, while Jonathan paced the waiting room, bargaining with a God he'd never believed in. The same department where he'd been told, in a consultation room that smelled of antiseptic and broken dreams, that despite their best efforts, despite the skill of their chief surgeon, his daughter's injuries were too severe. The badge seemed to grow larger in his vision, the words blurring as 7 years of suppressed grief crashed over him like a tsunami. He'd never met the surgeon who'd operated on Emma, had been too destroyed by loss to ask for details, too angry at the world to want to put a face to the person who'd failed to save his little girl. But now, staring at Dr. Naomi Williams, at the badge that identified her as the chief surgeon, at the woman he'd just pushed aside like she was nothing, Jonathan felt his legs go weak. Around them, the medical staff began to murmur. Someone whispered, "Did he just push Dr. Williams?" Another voice said, "That's the chief of surgery." A resident pulled out his phone, and Jonathan could see the moment becoming something larger than itself, something that would spread through the hospital's gossip network like wildfire. But all of that faded into background noise as Jonathan stared into the eyes of the woman who'd tried to save his daughter's life, the woman he'd just treated with casual disrespect, the woman whose skilled hands had been the last hope Emma had ever known. He began, his voice barely a whisper. Naomi saw the recognition dawning in his eyes, saw the exact moment when his entitled anger crumbled into something else entirely. She'd seen that look before, in the eyes of family members who'd just realized that the person they'd been dismissing, questioning, or challenging was the same person who'd held their loved one's heart in her hands. "Dr. Williams," she finished for him, her voice carrying both professional dignity and a warning that he'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. "Chief of Cardiovascular Surgery, the person you just pushed aside because you assumed I wasn't important enough to deserve your respect." The words landed like physical blows. Jonathan felt his folder slip from nerveless fingers, legal documents scattering across the linoleum floor like fallen leaves. The pharmaceutical merger, the board meeting, the Reed family expectations, none of it mattered anymore. All that mattered was the woman standing before him, the woman who'd tried to save Emma, the woman he'd just dishonored in the worst possible way. "Oh God," he breathed. And the sound was like a prayer and a confession and a plea for forgiveness all rolled into one. "Oh God, what have I done?" The silence stretched between them like a chasm, filled with the weight of recognition and the echo of a moment that couldn't be taken back. Jonathan's scattered documents lay forgotten on the hospital floor as he stared at Dr. Williams, his face drained of all color. Naomi felt the familiar walls slamming back into place around her heart, the same protective barriers that had kept her functioning through medical school, through residency, through the countless moments when she'd had to prove herself worthy of occupying spaces that weren't meant for someone who looked like her. "I need to get to surgery," she said, her voice professionally detached, as if the last 60 seconds had been nothing more than a minor interruption in her day. She turned away from him, addressing the nurses who'd witnessed everything. "Mrs. Patterson's pre-op needs to be completed in the next 15 minutes. Make sure her labs are ready for my review." But even as she spoke, her hands trembled slightly, a tremor so subtle that only someone trained to notice the smallest details would catch it. The push itself hadn't hurt her physically, but something deeper had been shaken loose, something she'd spent 7 years learning to suppress. Jonathan bent to gather his scattered papers, his movements mechanical and distant. The pharmaceutical merger documents seemed foreign now, like artifacts from someone else's life. His phone continued buzzing with increasingly urgent messages from the boardroom, but the sound felt muffled, as if it were coming from underwater. "Dr. Williams," he began, his voice hoarse with something that might have been grief or shame or both. "Don't." The word came out sharper than she'd intended, causing several nearby staff members to glance in their direction. Naomi softened her tone slightly, but the steel remained. "Just don't." She turned and walked toward the surgical wing, her stride purposeful but not quite as steady as usual. Every step felt like she was walking away from a ghost, from a reminder of the night that had changed everything. The night when another impatient man, another person who thought his urgency mattered more than anyone else's life, had made a choice that destroyed her world. Jonathan stood frozen in the corridor, holding his crumpled documents, watching her disappear around the corner. The other medical staff were beginning to disperse, but he could feel their eyes on him, could hear the whispered conversations that would follow him through the hospital's halls. "Sir." A young orderly approached cautiously. "Are you all right?" The question almost made Jonathan laugh, but it would have been the kind of laughter that preceded a complete breakdown. "All right." He just pushed the woman who'd spent 6 hours trying to save his daughter's life. He'd treated her like an obstacle, dismissed her authority, and done it all while she wore the badge that identified her as one of the most skilled surgeons in the city. "I'm fine," he lied, straightening his tie with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. I need to get to my meeting." But even as he said it, Jonathan knew the meeting no longer mattered. How could he sit in a boardroom discussing profit margins and market strategies when the woman who'd held Emma's heart in her hands was 3 floors away, preparing for surgery, carrying the memory of his disrespect? His phone rang, Dr. Martinez, no doubt calling to ask where the hell he was. Jonathan stared at the screen until it stopped ringing, then turned it off completely. For the first time in his adult life, business would have to wait. Meanwhile, in the surgical prep area, Naomi scrubbed her hands with more force than necessary, the hot water running pink as she worked the antiseptic soap between her fingers. The routine usually calmed her, the methodical cleansing, the transformation from person to surgeon, the moment when everything else fell away, except the life waiting on the operating table. But today the ritual felt hollow. Dr. Williams, Dr. Sarah Chen, her senior resident, appeared at her elbow. "Mrs. Patterson's labs just came back. Hemoglobin is at 10.2, which is better than yesterday, but her potassium is slightly elevated." Naomi forced herself to focus on the numbers, on the clinical decision-making that had become as natural as breathing. Elevated by how much? 4.8. Still within acceptable range for surgery. She dried her hands methodically, each motion practiced and precise. "But I want cardiac monitoring throughout the procedure. Any sign of arrhythmia, and we'll need to correct the electrolyte imbalance before we close." Dr. Chen nodded, making notes on her tablet. "Dr. Williams, if you don't mind me asking, what happened out there in the corridor?" The question hung in the air like antiseptic fumes, sharp and impossible to ignore. Naomi could deflect it, could maintain the professional distance she'd cultivated over the years, but the tremor in her hands betrayed the cost of such control. "Nothing that affects my ability to perform surgery," she said finally. It was both true and completely inadequate, and they both knew it. Dr. Chen hesitated, clearly wanting to say more, but the OR doors opened and the surgical team appeared, ready to prep Mrs. Patterson. The moment for personal conversation passed, replaced by the urgent choreography of saving a life. As Naomi entered the operating room, she felt the familiar transformation beginning, the way her personal struggles fell away in the face of medical necessity. But today something was different. Today the ghost of another surgery haunted her movements, another patient whose life had hung in the balance while she'd fought against impossible odds. Emma Reed, 8 years old, massive internal trauma from a vehicle collision. The girl had arrived at St. Mary's on a night when Naomi was supposed to be off duty, when she was supposed to be home with her own family, celebrating her wedding anniversary with her husband Michael and playing board games with their 6-year-old son David. Instead, she'd spent 6 hours in this same operating room, using every skill she'd ever learned to repair a small heart that had been damaged beyond what medical science could reasonably fix. She'd worked with the desperate precision of someone who understood that failure meant destroying a family, that success meant everything to people she'd never met. In the end, it hadn't been enough. Emma Reed had died 3 days later from complications that no surgeon, no matter how skilled, could have prevented. It was a loss that happened sometimes in her profession, patients who arrived too damaged, injuries too severe, time too short. But it was also the night that changed everything for Naomi. The night when her own family, tired of playing second fiddle to her career, tired of canceled dinners and missed bedtime stories, had driven to her in-laws' house to wait for her to come home from surgery. The night when another driver, like the one who'd hurt Emma Reed, had run a red light and taken away the 2 people who meant everything to her. By the time Naomi had finished trying to save Emma Reed, her own husband and son were beyond saving. "Dr. Williams," the anesthesiologist's voice pulled her back to the present. Patient is under and stable, ready when you are. Naomi looked down at Mrs. Patterson, at the grandmother whose family waited in anguish for news, and forced Emma Reed's ghost back into the shadows where it belonged. This was her gift and her curse, the ability to compartmentalize, to function, to save lives even when her own felt like it had ended years ago. "Scalpel," she said, and her voice was steady again, professional again, empty of everything except the precision required to hold a human heart in her hands. But upstairs, in a hospital corridor that still smelled faintly of antiseptic and regret, Jonathan Reed sat on a bench meant for waiting families and stared at his phone. The pharmaceutical merger could fail. The board meeting could happen without him. The Reed family name could weather another disappointment. None of it mattered compared to the woman who was, at this very moment, using the same skilled hands he'd dismissed to save another life. The same hands that had tried to save Emma. Have you ever had a moment where you realized you completely misjudged someone? How do you think we can overcome our own biases and assumptions? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. His assistant had left 17 voicemails. His father would be furious. The business world would interpret his absence as weakness, as another sign that Jonathan Reed wasn't worthy of the family legacy. But for the first time in 7 years, Jonathan didn't care about any of that. All he cared about was finding a way to undo the damage he'd done to the woman who'd tried to save his daughter's life, and discovering why fate had brought them together in the most painful way possible. The waiting room clock ticked toward 9 a.m., and Jonathan Reed made a decision that would have shocked his younger self. He was going to wait. However long it took, whatever it cost him professionally, he was going to wait for Dr. Naomi Williams to finish saving Mrs. Patterson's life. Because some things like honor, like respect, like the debt he owed to the woman who'd fought for Emma, were more important than business. Even if she never forgave him for forgetting that. The hospital's emergency alert system crackled to life at 10:47 a.m., just as Dr. Naomi Williams was closing the final suture on Mrs. Patterson's triple bypass. The grandmother's surgery had been flawless, each vessel grafted with precision, each heartbeat monitored with the vigilance of someone who understood that perfection was the only acceptable outcome. "Attention all staff and visitors," the voice echoed through the corridors with practiced calm. "St. Mary's Hospital is implementing a Code Silver lockdown due to a security incident in the surrounding area. All personnel and visitors must remain in secure locations until further notice. This is not a drill." Naomi's hands never wavered as she completed the suture, but something cold settled in her stomach. Code Silver meant an external threat, usually involving law enforcement activity that could spill into the hospital. The last time she'd experienced a lockdown, it had lasted 4 hours. "Dr. Williams," the OR nurse said quietly, "should we?" "We finish," Naomi replied without hesitation. "Mrs. Patterson's family needs to know she's safe before we worry about anything else." Meanwhile, Jonathan had spent the last 2 hours in the family waiting area adjacent to the surgical wing, his expensive suit wrinkled from sitting in plastic chairs, designed for people with more important things to worry about than comfort. He'd watched families come and go, had seen the way they clutched each other's hands during the endless wait for news, had remembered his own vigil in a similar room 7 years ago. His phone lay silent on the chair beside him. He'd turned it back on once to find 43 missed calls and 87 text messages, ranging from professional panic to personal disappointment. His assistant had been promoted to partner in the merger discussions. His father had left a voicemail that began with "Jonathan, this is completely unacceptable," and ended with words that would take months to forget. But none of it moved him from the uncomfortable chair in the waiting room. He owed Dr. Williams an apology that couldn't be delivered through intermediaries or corporate gestures. It had to be person to person, professional to professional, human to human. The Code Silver announcement changed everything. Security guards appeared in the corridors with practiced efficiency, checking rooms and guiding people to designated safe areas. The family waiting room where Jonathan sat became one of these zones, its proximity to the surgical wing making it a natural gathering point for medical staff transitioning between procedures. "Sir," a security guard approached Jonathan, "I need you to move to the center of the room, away from the windows." Jonathan complied, finding himself suddenly surrounded by other waiting families, off-duty nurses grabbing coffee between shifts, and medical residents who'd been caught in the corridor when the lockdown began. The room, which had felt spacious when he'd been alone with his guilt, now felt cramped and intimate. That's when Dr. Naomi Williams entered. She'd finished Mrs. Patterson's surgery and was heading to the family consultation room to deliver the good news when the lockdown trapped her in the waiting area with everyone else. She still wore her surgical scrubs, her hair still covered by the mint green cap that had become damp with perspiration during the 3-hour procedure. Their eyes met across the crowded room, and Jonathan felt his chest tighten with a combination of shame and something else, something that looked uncomfortably like recognition of a shared burden he didn't understand. Naomi considered turning around, finding another safe area to wait out the lockdown, but the family consultation room was through this waiting area, and Mrs. Patterson's daughter deserved to know her mother was alive and recovering. Personal discomfort would have to take second place to professional duty. She moved toward the consultation room, navigating between anxious families and displaced staff, her path taking her directly past Jonathan's chair. He stood as she approached, an instinctive gesture of respect that felt both appropriate and completely inadequate. "Dr. Williams," he said quietly, his voice barely audible over the nervous chatter filling the room. She paused, not because she wanted to, but because something in his tone demanded acknowledgement. This wasn't the entitled businessman from the corridor, this was someone else entirely, someone who looked like he'd spent the morning wrestling with demons and losing. "Mister?" She realized she'd never actually learned his name, had never asked because she'd assumed he was just another privileged man, whose time was more important than everyone else's. "Reed," he said, and the name hit her like a physical blow. Jonathan Reed. Reed, the same last name as the 8-year-old girl who died on her table 7 years ago, the same family that had haunted her dreams and driven her to work 16-hour days in an attempt to save enough lives to balance the scales of the one she couldn't save. The consultation room suddenly felt very far away. "I see," Naomi said, and those 2 words carried 7 years of weight, 7 years of wondering about the family she'd failed, 7 years of carrying the guilt of not being skilled enough or fast enough or miraculous enough to save a child. Jonathan watched recognition dawn in her eyes, saw the exact moment when the connection completed itself. His daughter, her patient. The surgery that had brought them together in tragedy and was now binding them together in a hospital waiting room during a lockdown that felt more like fate than coincidence. "I think we need to talk," he said, and it wasn't a request so much as an acknowledgement of something inevitable. Naomi looked around the crowded waiting room, at the families clinging to each other, at the medical staff trying to maintain calm professionalism while trapped away from their duties. Privacy would be impossible here, but perhaps that was for the best. Perhaps some conversations needed witnesses to keep them from becoming something that couldn't be taken back. She sat down in the chair across from him, maintaining enough distance to feel safe but close enough that they could speak without being overheard. The institutional furniture seemed to shrink the space between them, making the moment feel more intimate than either was prepared for. "Mrs. Patterson came through the surgery perfectly," she said, because medical updates were safe territory, professional ground where she could maintain control. "Triple bypass, but her heart was stronger than we expected. She'll make a full recovery." It was a peace offering of sorts, proof that she was still the surgeon who saved lives, still the woman who fought for patients with skill and dedication. It was also a reminder that success was possible, that not every story ended the way Emma's had. Jonathan nodded, accepting the information like a gift he didn't deserve. That's wonderful news for her family. The silence that followed was filled with everything they weren't saying, apologies and explanations, and 7 years of parallel grief that had finally collided in a hospital corridor. Around them, the waiting room buzzed with nervous energy as people checked their phones for updates about the security situation, but Jonathan and Naomi existed in a bubble of shared history that made the rest of the world feel distant. "I didn't know," Jonathan said finally, his voice rough with emotion. "This morning when I pushed you, I had no idea who you were, what you'd done for Emma, what you'd tried to do." Naomi studied his face, looking for signs of manipulation or calculated sympathy, but what she saw was raw grief, the kind that 7 years hadn't been able to heal, the kind that matched her own too closely for comfort. "Would it have mattered?" she asked quietly. "If you'd known who I was, would you have treated me differently?" The question hung between them like a challenge, and Jonathan felt the weight of honesty settling on his shoulders. Would he have, or would he have been even worse, blaming her for Emma's death, holding her personally responsible for his loss? "I don't know," he admitted, and the honesty felt like pulling splinters from his soul. "I'd like to think so, but I don't know." It wasn't the answer Naomi had expected, but it was more honest than most people would have been. She'd spent her career dealing with grateful families and angry ones, with people who treated her like a miracle worker and others who blamed her for tragedies beyond anyone's control. But she'd rarely encountered someone willing to admit their own prejudices so plainly. "Your daughter," she said carefully, "Emma, she was one of the bravest patients I've ever treated." Jonathan's breath caught in his throat. In 7 years no one had talked to him about Emma as a patient, as a person who'd fought and struggled and shown courage in her final days. Everyone had focused on the tragedy, the loss, the unfairness of it all. But no one had talked about Emma herself. "She never complained," Naomi continued, her professional mask slipping slightly to reveal the human being underneath. "Even when she was scared, even when the procedures hurt, she worried more about making her nurses smile than about her own pain. She asked me once if I had children, and when I said yes, she told me I was lucky because kids make everything better." The words were like water on a drought-stricken field, the first time anyone had shared memories of Emma that weren't soaked in pity or tragedy. Jonathan felt tears gathering in his eyes, the first tears he'd allowed himself to shed in public since the funeral. "She would have liked you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Emma always loved doctors and nurses. She wanted to be a pediatric surgeon when she grew up, wanted to fix kids like the nice people fixed her after she broke her arm when she was 5. The irony was devastating. His daughter had dreamed of becoming someone like Dr. Williams, had admired the medical profession that had ultimately been unable to save her. But it was also beautiful in its way, a connection across time that made Emma's memory feel alive in the sterile hospital waiting room. "She would have been an excellent surgeon," Naomi said, and meant it. She had the determination for it, the compassion. They sat in silence for a moment, both lost in memories of an 8-year-old girl who'd been gone for 7 years but was suddenly present in the space between them. Around them, the lockdown continued, trapping them in proximity that felt both accidental and inevitable. The security guard's radio crackled with an update, code Silver extended for at least another hour, perimeter secure but situation ongoing. Jonathan looked at Dr. Williams, at Naomi, and realized that fate had given them time they wouldn't have chosen but desperately needed. Time to talk about Emma, about guilt and grief and the weight of professional responsibility. Time to discover that the person he'd dismissed as an obstacle was actually someone who understood loss in ways he'd never imagined. "I owe you an apology," he said, "for this morning, for how I treated you. But I think I owe you more than that." Naomi met his eyes, seeing something there that looked like the beginning of genuine respect, the recognition of shared humanity that had been missing from their first encounter. "What do you think you owe me, Mr. Reed?" "The truth," he said. "About who I was when Emma died. About who I've become since then. About why I've spent 7 years running from the grief instead of dealing with it." The waiting room suddenly felt less like a prison and more like a sanctuary, a place where two people could finally talk about a little girl who'd connected their lives in ways neither had understood until now. Outside, the security situation continued, but inside, Jonathan Reed and Dr. Naomi Williams began the delicate process of discovering that sometimes the people we need most are the ones we encounter in the moments we least expect. The lockdown stretched into its second hour, and the waiting room had settled into an uneasy rhythm of hushed conversations and nervous phone scrolling. Jonathan had loosened his tie, the first time in years he'd allowed himself to appear less than perfectly composed in public. Naomi had removed her surgical cap, revealing natural hair that she touched unconsciously when she was thinking, a gesture Jonathan found himself noticing despite everything. "Tell me about her," Naomi said quietly, breaking the silence that had settled between them. "Not the patient, the little girl." Jonathan's hands found the wallet in his jacket pocket, fingers tracing the worn leather edges of a photograph he'd carried for 7 years but rarely looked at. He pulled it out carefully, as if it might disintegrate in the fluorescent hospital light. The picture showed Emma at a school carnival, her gap-toothed grin bright beneath a crown of chocolate-brown curls. She wore a pink princess dress that she'd insisted on wearing to the event, even though it was completely impractical for carnival games. Cotton candy stuck to her fingers, and her eyes sparkled with the kind of pure joy that only 8-year-olds could access. "This was taken 3 weeks before the accident," Jonathan said, his voice thick with memory. "She'd won a goldfish at the ring toss, which she immediately named Dr. Whiskers because she was convinced it would grow up to be a veterinarian." Naomi studied the photograph, seeing not just the patient she'd tried to save, but the whole person, the dreams and personality, and infinite potential that had been lying on her operating table. It made the loss feel both more real and more devastating. "She looks like trouble," Naomi said gently, and Jonathan actually smiled for the first time since the morning's confrontation. "The best kind," he agreed. "Emma could talk her way out of anything. She once convinced her teacher to let the class have extra recess because learning outside is still learning, just with more vitamin D." He paused, the smile fading. "She got that from her mother, the charm, the optimism. I was always the serious one, the one worried about schedules and responsibility." "Was?" Naomi caught the past tense, understanding instinctively that the story was more complicated than just a father's grief. Jonathan's hands tightened around the photograph. "Emma's mother, my wife Claire, she died when Emma was 6, cancer. Ovarian cancer that we caught too late because she kept putting off doctor visits, kept saying she was too busy with Emma and work to worry about herself." The admission hung between them, another layer of loss that explained the desperation Naomi had sensed in him. Not just a father who'd lost his daughter, but a man who'd lost his entire family piece by piece. "After Claire died, it was just Emma and me," Jonathan continued. "I threw myself into work because that's what Reed men do. We solve problems, we provide, we fix things. But Emma just wanted her dad. She wanted bedtime stories, and Saturday morning pancakes, and someone to listen to her theories about why cats purr, and whether fish have feelings." "Did you give her those things?" Naomi asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Jonathan's silence was confirmation enough. "I thought I was protecting her by building a stable future. The pharmaceutical company, the merger deals, the business success, it was all supposed to be for her. To give her every advantage, every opportunity Claire and I never had." He laughed bitterly. "Instead, I gave her a father who was always checking his phone during school plays and bringing work home during family dinners." Naomi felt something crack open in her chest, a recognition of shared guilt that was almost too painful to acknowledge. "The night of her accident," she said carefully. "Do you remember where you were when it happened?" "In my office." The words came out like a confession. It was a Thursday evening, and I was supposed to be home for dinner. Emma had made me promise we'd work on her science project together, something about plant growth and music. But there was this contract dispute, and I thought if I could just finish reviewing the terms. He didn't need to finish. They both understood the weight of those unfinished evenings, those promises postponed, those moments when professional obligation had taken priority over love. "Emma called me around 6:30, Jonathan continued. "She said she was hungry and asked if she could walk to the corner deli to get us both sandwiches. I was distracted, focused on the contracts, and I said yes without really thinking about it. I even gave her my credit card over the phone because I was too busy to leave the office." Naomi closed her eyes, seeing the trajectory of that evening with painful clarity. An 8-year-old walking alone to get dinner because her father was too busy to come home. A drunk driver running a red light at exactly the wrong moment. The collision that had brought Emma to her operating table and set in motion everything that followed. "It wasn't your fault," she said, and the words felt both true and completely inadequate. "Wasn't it?" Jonathan's voice cracked. "If I'd come home when I promised, if I'd put down the damn contracts and made dinner with my daughter, if I'd been the father she deserved instead of the businessman I thought she needed, she'd still be gone," Naomi finished quietly. "The drunk driver would have hit someone else, some other family would be living this grief. Tragedy doesn't negotiate with our schedules, Jonathan. It doesn't care about our good intentions or our regrets." The use of his first name felt significant, a shift from professional distance to something more personal. Jonathan looked up from Emma's photograph to find Naomi watching him with an expression that was part compassion, part recognition, and part something else he couldn't identify. "You sound like someone who knows," he said. Naomi was quiet for so long that Jonathan began to think she wouldn't answer. Around them, the waiting room continued its nervous rhythm, but their corner had become an island of shared grief, where honesty felt both dangerous and necessary. "I was supposed to be home that night too," she said finally. "The night Emma came in. It was my wedding anniversary, 7 years married to my husband Michael. We'd planned dinner at home, just the three of us. Michael had picked up ingredients for David's favorite meal, mac and cheese with the fancy truffle oil that cost way too much but made our 6-year-old feel sophisticated." Jonathan felt his stomach drop, understanding instinctively that this story wouldn't end well. "But then Emma arrived," Naomi continued, her voice steady but distant, as if she were reciting someone else's life. "Massive trauma. Multiple internal injuries, the kind of case that required immediate surgical intervention. Michael understood, he always understood. He said they'd wait, that David could stay up a little later, that my anniversary dinner could happen any night, but saving a little girl's life could only happen right then." She paused, her fingers finding the wedding ring she still wore on her right hand, moved there after the funeral but never removed. "The surgery took 6 hours. 6 hours of fighting for Emma's life, while my husband and son drove to his parents' house to wait for me. They were going to surprise me with a cake when I got home, something to salvage the anniversary even though dinner was ruined." Her voice began to shake slightly. "They never made it to his parents' house." Jonathan felt the air leave his lungs. "Oh God." "Another drunk driver," Naomi said, and the words sounded like they'd been carved from ice. "Different intersection, same result. While I was in OR3 trying to save your daughter, my family was dying in the exact same way hers had." The cruel symmetry of it was devastating. While Naomi had been fighting to give Emma back to her father, her own husband and son had been taken away by the same kind of senseless accident. 2 families destroyed in one night, connected by tragedy and the woman whose skilled hands hadn't been able to save anyone who mattered. "Michael was 34, she continued, her voice growing stronger even as tears began to track down her cheeks. "He taught high school history and coached Little League baseball. He used to grade papers at the kitchen table after dinner, and David would sit next to him coloring in old workbooks, pretending to be a teacher too. Jonathan could see them in his mind, the family Naomi had lost while trying to save his. The husband who'd understood her calling, the son who'd wanted to follow in his mother's footsteps. A life filled with the kind of ordinary happiness that only became precious after it was gone. David was the kind of kid who collected bugs in mason jars and gave them names, Naomi continued. He wanted to be an entomologist when he grew up, said he was going to discover new beetles and name them after his favorite superheroes. He'd been planning to surprise me that night by showing me the butterfly cocoon he'd been watching in our backyard. It was supposed to emerge any day. Did it? Jonathan asked, though he wasn't sure why the detail mattered. I don't know, Naomi admitted. I never went back to that house. Couldn't. I sold it 3 months later without ever seeing the backyard again. They sat in silence, both lost in memories of the people they'd loved and lost, both understanding now why fate had brought them together in a hospital corridor on a random Thursday morning. It wasn't coincidence, it was completion, the closing of a circle that had been 7 years in the making. How do you think shared tragedy can either divide people or bring them together? What role does understanding play in healing? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. I became a different person after that night. Naomi said, threw myself into surgery the same way you threw yourself into business. Worked 16-hour days, took every difficult case, became the surgeon who never said no to a challenge. I told myself it was about saving lives, but really it was about proving that Michael and David's deaths meant something, that their sacrifice had made me better at saving other people's families. Has it worked? Jonathan asked. No, she admitted, because every life I save reminds me of the ones I couldn't. Every grateful family makes me think about Michael and David waiting at home with anniversary cake I never got to taste. Jonathan understood the weight of that guilt, the way professional success could feel like betrayal when personal loss was the price. He'd built a pharmaceutical empire while Emma's bedroom remained exactly as she'd left it, untouched and waiting for a little girl who would never come home. I've spent 7 years angry at you, he said quietly. At the surgeon who couldn't save Emma. I never knew you'd lost your family the same night, never imagined that you'd paid the same price I had. Would it have changed anything? Naomi asked. If you'd known? Jonathan considered the question honestly. I don't think so. Grief doesn't make room for other people's pain, does it? It's too big, too consuming. It took everything I had, just to keep breathing, let alone worry about what anyone else was suffering. No, Naomi agreed. It doesn't. I used to resent the families who blamed me for losing their loved ones, but now I understand. When you're drowning in grief, everyone else becomes responsible for your pain because it's too overwhelming to carry alone. They were quiet again, but it was a different kind of silence now, not the awkward distance of strangers, but the companionable quiet of people who'd found unexpected understanding in each other's stories. The security guard's radio crackled with another update. Code Silver still active. Estimated additional hour before all clear. Jonathan looked at Naomi, at this woman whose life had intersected with his in the most painful way possible, and realized that the lockdown had given them something neither had expected, the time to discover that they weren't alone in their grief, and the space to begin imagining what healing might look like when it was shared rather than carried in isolation. What happens now? He asked. Naomi met his eyes, seeing not the entitled businessman from the morning but a fellow survivor of unimaginable loss. I don't know, she said, but I think Emma would want us to figure it out together. For the first time in 7 years, neither of them felt completely alone with their grief. The third hour of the lockdown brought an unexpected shift in the waiting room's atmosphere. What had started as nervous tension had evolved into something approaching community, strangers sharing snacks, medical staff comforting anxious families, and conversations that moved beyond the immediate crisis to touch on deeper human connections. Jonathan had removed his suit jacket entirely, rolling up his sleeves in a gesture that would have horrified his corporate self just hours earlier. Naomi had found herself sitting closer to him, close enough that their knees almost touched, close enough that their shared grief felt less like a burden and more like a bridge. "Can I ask you something?" Jonathan said, his voice carrying a hesitation that hadn't been there before, not the uncertainty of a businessman losing control, but the vulnerability of someone stepping into unfamiliar emotional territory. "Of course. When you were operating on Emma, did you know about your family? I mean, did some part of you sense that something was wrong?" Naomi considered the question carefully. In 7 years no one had asked her about the surgery itself, about what it had felt like to hold Emma's heart while her own world was ending miles away. "No," she said finally. "Surgery creates this bubble of focus where nothing else exists. It has to. You can't save someone's life while worrying about grocery lists or anniversary dinners or anything beyond the patient in front of you. But," she paused, remembering something she'd never shared with anyone, not the grief counselor the hospital had mandated, not the few colleagues who'd tried to offer support. "But there was this moment," she continued, "around hour 4 of Emma's surgery, when her heart rate suddenly stabilized. She'd been fighting us the whole time, and then she just settled, like she'd made peace with something. I remember thinking that she was a fighter, that she had something to live for that was giving her strength." Jonathan's breath caught. "What time was that? Do you remember?" "It was 11:47 p.m. I remember because I looked at the surgical clock and thought we might actually make it through." Jonathan's face went pale. That's almost exactly when the other accident happened. When Michael and David," the implication hung between them, impossible and undeniable. At the moment when Emma had found peace on the operating table, Naomi's family had been taken, as if somehow in the mysterious mathematics of loss, one tragedy had borrowed strength from another. "Do you think," Naomi began, then stopped, shaking her head. "No, that's ridiculous." "What?" Jonathan pressed gently. "I was going to say, do you think Emma knew that she was fighting not just for herself, but for someone else who was about to lose everything? But that's the kind of thinking that leads to madness, isn't it? Looking for meaning in coincidence, patterns in chaos." Jonathan was quiet for a moment, then surprised them both by saying, "Emma always believed in connections most people couldn't see. She used to tell me that butterflies in our garden were messages from her mother, that the reason flowers bloomed was because the earth was happy. Maybe it's not madness, maybe it's just a way of understanding the world that we lose when we grow up." It was the most hopeful thing either of them had said in hours, and it opened a door to conversations that felt less like mourning and more like remembering. "Tell me about David," Jonathan said. "What was he like?" Naomi's smile was genuine for the first time all day. "Curious about everything. He once spent an entire afternoon trying to figure out why soap bubbles were round, conducting experiments with different soap concentrations and bubble wands. Michael found him in the backyard covered in suds, completely serious about his scientific method." "He sounds like Emma," Jonathan said. "She was always asking questions no one could answer. Like why blue and yellow make green but red and white make pink. Or why some people are afraid of spiders when spiders are just trying to catch the bugs that actually bite you. Michael used to say that kids ask the questions adults are too scared to think about," Naomi said. "Like why do we work so much if it makes us unhappy, or why don't people share more when sharing feels good?" "Smart man," Jonathan said, and meant it. "What did he teach?" "American history, but he made it personal. Instead of just dates and battles, he'd talk about the families torn apart by war, the love letters soldiers wrote, the women who disguised themselves as men to fight for causes they believed in. His students adored him because he made the past feel alive." Jonathan found himself genuinely curious about Michael Williams, this man who'd understood that history was about human connections rather than memorized facts. It should have felt strange, being interested in the life of Naomi's deceased husband, but instead it felt important, like honoring the full scope of what had been lost that night. "He sounds like he would have been a good father-in-law to complain about," Jonathan said, then immediately looked mortified. "I'm sorry, that was completely inappropriate." But Naomi was laughing, actually laughing, for the first time since the morning's confrontation. "He would have been terrible," she agreed. Michael was one of those people who made dad jokes unironically and thought they were hilarious. David used to roll his eyes and say, "Daddy, that's not funny," but then he'd giggle anyway. The laughter felt like sunlight breaking through clouds, unexpected and warming. Around them, the waiting room continued its nervous energy, but their corner had become something else entirely, a space where grief could coexist with joy, where memories could be shared without drowning in sorrow. "I haven't talked about them like this," Naomi admitted, "about the good parts, the everyday parts. Everyone always wants to focus on the tragedy, the loss, but they were more than just the way they died." "So was Emma," Jonathan said. "People always say, 'I'm sorry for your loss,' and then change the subject, like talking about her would make it worse. But she was funny and stubborn and brilliant. She deserves to be remembered for who she was, not just for what happened to her." They sat quietly for a moment, both feeling something they hadn't experienced in years, the simple pleasure of having someone who understood not just the grief, but the love that made the grief so devastating. "What would they think of us?" Naomi asked suddenly, "sitting here together talking about them?" Jonathan considered the question seriously. "Emma would probably have a theory about why we needed to meet. Something about how people find each other when they need each other most, even if they don't know it at the time. And she'd be planning how to fix us," Naomi added with a small smile. "Emma strikes me as someone who thought every problem had a solution if you just tried hard enough." "Exactly. She once told me that sad people just needed to remember how to see the good things again, and that it was everyone's job to help with that." Jonathan paused. "I think she would have liked you. A lot." "Michael and David would have liked you too," Naomi said. "Michael always said the best people were the ones who cared so much it hurt. And David would have been fascinated by your business. He loved understanding how things worked, how all the pieces fit together." The conversation was interrupted by a hospital volunteer wheeling a coffee cart into the waiting room. "Complimentary coffee and snacks during the lockdown," she announced. "Doctor's orders to keep everyone comfortable." Jonathan stood immediately. "Can I get you something? Coffee? Tea?" It was such a simple gesture, but after years of having every need anticipated by assistants and staff, the act of serving someone else felt surprisingly natural. More than that, it felt important. "Coffee would be wonderful," Naomi said. "Black, please." He returned with 2 steaming cups and a plate of shortbread cookies that reminded him of the ones Emma used to make with Claire during Christmas baking marathons. As he handed Naomi her coffee, their fingers brushed briefly, the first intentional physical contact since the morning's collision. Neither pulled away immediately. "This is strange," Naomi said quietly, not referring to the coffee. "Good strange or bad strange?" Jonathan asked. "I don't know yet. But not bad." She sipped her coffee, studying his face over the rim of the cup. "When was the last time you talked to someone, really talked, about things that mattered?" Jonathan considered the question honestly. "Probably not since Claire got sick. After Emma died, I surrounded myself with people who wanted to discuss quarterly reports and market projections, safer topics." "I've been hiding in surgical suites," Naomi admitted. 18-hour days, emergency calls, anything to avoid going home to an empty house where I might have to think about something other than saving lives." "Has it worked?" "No," she said simply. "The quiet always finds you eventually, usually around 3 in the morning when your hands are steady enough for surgery but your heart is still broken." Jonathan nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. "For me it's Sunday mornings. Emma and I used to make elaborate breakfast spreads, pancakes, bacon, fresh fruit cut into flower shapes. Now Sundays feel like they last about 48 hours. Michael used to grade papers on Sunday mornings while David and I built elaborate blanket forts in the living room. We called them architectural marvels of comfort engineering. They were quiet again, but it was comfortable now, the silence of people who'd found unexpected understanding in shared experience. Dr. Williams, a young nurse, approached their corner. "Mrs. Patterson's daughter is asking if she can speak with you when the lockdown ends. She wanted to thank you personally." Naomi nodded. "Of course, tell her I'll come find her as soon as we get the all clear." After the nurse left, Jonathan looked at her with something that might have been admiration. "Do you know how remarkable you are? You saved a woman's life this morning, dealt with my inexcusable behavior, got trapped in a lockdown, and you're still thinking about your patient's family." "It's my job," Naomi said, but she looked pleased by the recognition. "No," Jonathan said firmly. "Your job is surgical skill. What you're doing is caring, and that's something entirely different. Something much rarer." The compliment hit her unexpectedly, and Naomi felt something crack open in her chest, not the painful fracture of grief, but something warmer, like a door opening after being locked for too long. "Thank you," she said simply. That means something." The security radio crackled again. "Code Silver nearing resolution. Expect all clear within 30 minutes. Both of them looked toward the speaker, and Jonathan realized with surprise that he wasn't eager for the lockdown to end. The last few hours had been the most genuine human connection he'd experienced in years, and the thought of returning to his empty penthouse and interrupted business deals felt suddenly hollow. "What happens when this is over?" he asked. "Do we go back to our separate lives and pretend this conversation never happened?" Naomi met his eyes, seeing her own uncertainty reflected there. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I don't have a blueprint for this. For finding someone who understands." "Neither do I," Jonathan admitted, "but I know I don't want to lose it. This, whatever this is." "Connection," Naomi said quietly. "I think what this is called connection, and you're right, it's too precious to waste." They sat there, drinking coffee and eating shortbread cookies, two people who'd found each other in the middle of grief and discovered that sometimes healing began not with forgetting the past, but with finding someone who understood its weight. Outside, the security situation was resolving. Soon they'd be released back into their separate worlds, she to her surgical schedules and empty house, he to his pharmaceutical empire and hollow success. But something had changed in the waiting room during the lockdown, something that couldn't be undone by returning to their regular lives. They'd found each other, and in doing so had found the possibility that healing didn't have to be a solitary journey. The question now was whether they'd be brave enough to explore what that might mean. The all-clear announcement came at 2:15 p.m., crackling through the hospital's PA system with bureaucratic efficiency. "Code Silver has been lifted. Normal operations may resume. Thank you for your patience and cooperation." The waiting room immediately began to empty as people eager to return to their interrupted lives gathered belongings and headed for exits. But Jonathan and Naomi remained seated, neither quite ready to break the fragile connection they'd built during the lockdown. "I should go check on Mrs. Patterson," Naomi said, though she made no move to stand. "And I should probably salvage whatever's left of my professional reputation," Jonathan replied, his phone having accumulated another dozen messages during the last hour. They were the right words, the responsible words, but they felt hollow after everything they'd shared. The institutional waiting room chairs that had brought them together now seemed designed to push them apart, back into their separate worlds of surgical schedules and corporate obligations. "Dr. Williams." The voice cut through their moment like a scalpel. Dr. Robert Chen, the hospital's chief of staff, approached with the brisk efficiency of someone who'd spent the lockdown managing crisis protocols rather than personal revelations. "I need to speak with you immediately." Naomi stood, automatically shifting back into professional mode. "Of course, is this about the lockdown procedures?" No. Dr. Chen's expression was grim as he glanced meaningfully at Jonathan. It's about the incident this morning. In the corridor, Jonathan felt his stomach drop. In the intimacy of shared grief, he'd almost forgotten about the morning's confrontation, about the moment when he'd pushed Dr. Williams aside like she was nothing more than an obstacle, but of course it hadn't been forgotten. In a hospital, nothing went unnoticed, especially not when it involved the chief of cardiovascular surgery. Perhaps we should discuss this privately, Naomi said, her voice carefully neutral. I'm afraid that's not possible. Dr. Chen's tone carried the weight of administrative authority. Mr. Reed, Jonathan said, standing as well. Jonathan Reed. Mr. Reed, I understand you're the gentleman who physically assaulted Dr. Williams this morning. The word assaulted hit Jonathan like a physical blow. In the context of everything that had followed, the recognition, the shared stories, the unexpected connection, he'd almost managed to reframe the morning's events as a terrible misunderstanding rather than what it actually was. A white man pushing a black woman because he'd assumed his time was more important than her professional duties. Dr. Chen, Naomi began, perhaps we could. Dr. Williams, with respect, this isn't your decision to make. Dr. Chen's voice was firm but not unkind. We've had 3 separate reports of the incident, including video footage from the corridor security cameras. This is a serious matter that requires formal investigation. Jonathan felt the blood drain from his face. Video footage, of course there would be video footage. His moment of entitled rage, preserved forever in digital format, available for review by hospital administrators, legal teams and potentially the media. I want to be clear, Dr. Chen continued, addressing Jonathan directly, that St. Mary's Hospital has zero tolerance for harassment or intimidation of our staff, regardless of the circumstances. What you did this morning was completely unacceptable. I know, Jonathan said quietly. I know it was unacceptable. I was wrong, and Mr. Reed, Dr. Chen interrupted, I'm going to have to ask you to leave the hospital immediately. Hospital security will escort you out, and you're banned from the premises pending a full investigation. If you attempt to contact Dr. Williams or any other staff member about this incident, we will pursue legal action. The words hit like hammer blows. Jonathan looked at Naomi, seeing her professional mask sliding back into place, seeing the distance returning to her eyes as the reality of the situation reasserted itself. Dr. Chen, Naomi said carefully, Mr. Reed and I have had an opportunity to discuss the incident, and I think, Dr. Williams, I understand your desire to handle this diplomatically, but this goes beyond personal forgiveness. We have policies for a reason. Mr. Reed's behavior this morning was witnessed by multiple staff members, including residents and nurses who look to you for leadership. What kind of message does it send if we allow wealthy donors to physically intimidate our medical staff without consequences? Wealthy donors. The phrase hung in the air like poison gas, transforming Jonathan from a grieving father into a stereotype, a privileged businessman who thought his money could buy his way out of accountability. Is that what you think this is about? Jonathan asked, his voice tight with something that might have been anger or desperation. My money? Isn't it? Dr. Chen's expression was skeptical. The Reed Foundation has donated over $2 million to this hospital in the past 5 years. Are you telling me that has nothing to do with why you felt entitled to push aside our chief of surgery? The accusation was devastating because it contained just enough truth to be believable. The Reed Foundation had indeed donated millions to St. Mary's guilt money, Jonathan now realized, payments he'd made to ease his conscience about Emma's death without ever having to face the people who'd tried to save her. That's not, Jonathan began, but Dr. Chen wasn't finished. Mr. Reed, your family's donations are appreciated, but they don't grant you special privileges to mistreat our staff. Dr. Williams is one of the most respected surgeons in the city, and she doesn't deserve to be treated like a servant just because you're running late for a business meeting. Each word felt like a judgment, reducing the complexity of the morning's events to a simple narrative entitled "Rich Man Mistreats Dedicated Black Doctor." It was a story everyone could understand, complete with clear villains and heroes, requiring no nuance or deeper examination. Jonathan looked at Naomi, hoping to see some sign that she understood it had been more complicated than that the man who'd pushed her wasn't the same person who'd spent the last 3 hours sharing grief and finding connection. But Naomi's face had become professionally blank, and Jonathan realized with growing horror that she was reconsidering everything. The shared stories, the tentative bond, the possibility of healing together, all of it was being reinterpreted through the lens of power and privilege, money and institutional racism. "Dr. Williams," he said quietly, ignoring Dr. Chen entirely, "you know that's not what this was about. You know me now, you know why I was here, what Emma meant to both of us." "I thought I did," Naomi replied, and her voice was distant again, professional again. "But maybe I was seeing what I wanted to see, rather than what was actually there." The words cut deeper than any administrative reprimand could have. Jonathan realized that Dr. Chen's intervention had done more than threaten his hospital access, it had poisoned the well of understanding they'd spent hours building. "2 security guards are waiting by the elevator," Dr. Chen announced. "Mr. Reed, you'll need to come with them now." "Naomi," Jonathan said, using her first name as a desperate plea for the connection they'd found. "Don't let him do this. Don't let him turn this into something it wasn't." But even as he spoke, Jonathan could see her retreating behind professional walls, could see the doubt creeping into her eyes. Had their conversation been genuine, or had she simply been manipulated by a skilled businessman who'd learned exactly what to say to earn her sympathy? "Dr. Williams will not be discussing this matter further," Dr. Chen said firmly. "Mr. Reed, you need to leave now, or I'll have you arrested for trespassing." Jonathan looked around the waiting room that had become a sanctuary just hours earlier, now transformed back into an institutional space where he was unwelcome. Other staff members were watching the confrontation with barely concealed curiosity, and he realized that the story of his morning collision with Dr. Williams had spread throughout the hospital, gaining details and interpretations with each retelling. "I need you to know," he said to Naomi, his voice carrying the weight of everything they'd shared, "that what happened between us during the lockdown was real. The grief we talked about, the connection we found, that wasn't manipulation or guilt money or anything else. That was 2 people who needed to find each other." Naomi met his eyes for a moment, and Jonathan thought he saw something flicker there, recognition perhaps, or regret, but then her professional mask snapped back into place. "Mr. Reed," she said formally, "I think it would be best if you respected the hospital's decision and left voluntarily." The dismissal was complete and devastating. In the span of 10 minutes, Jonathan had gone from being someone she trusted with her deepest grief to being someone she needed protection from. The transformation felt surreal, like waking from a beautiful dream into a nightmare of his own making. "This isn't over," he said quietly, and immediately regretted the words as soon as they left his mouth. Dr. Chen stepped forward, his hand moving toward the phone clipped to his belt. "Mr. Reed, that sounds very much like a threat." "It's not a threat," Jonathan said quickly. "I just meant—" But there was no way to explain what he'd meant without making it worse, that he wouldn't give up on the connection they'd found, that he believed they needed each other in ways that transcended hospital policies and administrative procedures, that sometimes the most important relationships began with the worst possible first impressions. The security guards appeared at his elbows, not roughly, but with unmistakable authority. One of them spoke quietly. "Sir, we need you to come with us now." Jonathan looked at Naomi one last time, memorizing her face, trying to hold on to the woman who'd shared coffee and stories and grief during the lockdown, rather than the professional stranger who was watching him get escorted from the building. "Emma would have wanted us to find each other," he said, as the guards began to guide him toward the elevator. "She would have said this was exactly the kind of miracle she always believed in." Naomi flinched at the mention of Emma's name, and Jonathan realized too late that invoking his daughter's memory might sound like emotional manipulation rather than genuine belief. The elevator doors closed between them, and Jonathan found himself descending away from the waiting room, where he'd discovered that healing didn't have to be a solitary journey, away from the woman who'd understood his grief like no one else ever had. In the waiting room, Dr. Chen turned to Naomi with administrative efficiency. "I know this is difficult, Dr. Williams, but you did the right thing. Men like that think their money gives them the right to treat people however they want. We can't enable that behavior." Naomi nodded automatically, but inside she felt something breaking, not the clean break of professional disappointment, but the messy fracture of lost possibility. Had she been manipulated by a skilled businessman who'd known exactly which emotional buttons to press, or had she just lost the first genuine human connection she'd felt in 7 years because she'd been too afraid to trust it? "Dr. Williams?" Dr. Chen was looking at her with concern. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," she lied, falling back on the professional competence that had carried her through 7 years of grief and isolation. "I should go check on Mrs. Patterson." But as she walked toward the patient rooms, Naomi couldn't shake the feeling that she'd just made a terrible mistake, that she'd chosen the safety of institutional protection over the dangerous possibility of human connection. Behind her, the waiting room returned to its normal rhythm of medical urgency and family anxiety, as if the last 3 hours had never happened, as if two people hadn't found each other in the middle of shared grief only to lose each other again, to the very human tendency to choose fear over faith. The morning's collision had brought them together, but the afternoon's intervention had torn them apart, leaving both of them more alone than they'd been before they'd ever met. 3 days passed like a slow-motion funeral procession, each hour dragging Jonathan deeper into an isolation he hadn't experienced since the weeks immediately following Emma's death. His penthouse apartment, 30 floors above the city, furnished with the kind of minimalist luxury that magazines called aspirational, felt more like a tomb than a home. The pharmaceutical merger had collapsed spectacularly. News of his absence from the crucial board meeting had spread through financial circles like wildfire, accompanied by whispered speculation about personal issues and unreliable leadership. His assistant had been promoted to handle the remaining negotiations, and his father had left exactly one voicemail: "Jonathan, we need to discuss your future with the company. This is unacceptable." But none of it seemed to matter. The business empire he'd built as a monument to Emma's memory felt hollow now, a gilded distraction from the real work of healing he'd barely begun to understand. Jonathan stood at his floor-to-ceiling windows, looking down at the city where Dr. Naomi Williams was, at this very moment, saving someone's life with the same skilled hands she'd used to try to save Emma. He'd written 17 different letters to her, apologies, explanations, pleas for understanding, but had sent none of them. Every word felt inadequate. Every gesture seemed to prove Dr. Chen's point about wealthy men thinking their money could solve problems that required something deeper than financial transactions. His phone buzzed with another message from his legal team. The hospital's investigation was ongoing, and there was talk of formal charges being filed. Not for assault, the security footage showed clearly that his push hadn't been violent, but for harassment, intimidation, creating a hostile work environment. The lawyers spoke in terms of manageable settlements and reputation rehabilitation, the language of people who believed every problem had a price tag. But Jonathan had learned something during those 3 hours in the waiting room. Some things couldn't be bought, couldn't be negotiated, couldn't be solved with the kind of strategic thinking that built pharmaceutical empires. Some things required vulnerability, required faith, required the courage to risk being hurt in service of something larger than self-preservation. Emma's photograph sat on his coffee table, the same carnival picture he'd shown Naomi, now removed from his wallet and displayed where he could see it every day. In the picture, his 8-year-old daughter wore that gap-toothed grin that had once made him believe in magic, in the possibility that love could conquer any obstacle. "What would you do, Em?" he asked the photograph, his voice echoing in the empty apartment. "If you met someone who needed you, someone who understood your pain but was too scared to trust it, what would you do?" The answer came to him with the clarity of a child's logic. Emma would try. She wouldn't worry about rejection or embarrassment or the possibility of making things worse. She would simply try, because trying was how people found each other, and finding each other was the most important thing in the world. Jonathan picked up his phone and called his assistant. "Miranda, I need you to do something for me, something personal." Across the city, Dr. Naomi Williams was discovering that throwing herself into work, her traditional coping mechanism, was no longer providing the numbness she needed. 3 days of 18-hour shifts, emergency surgeries, and administrative duties had left her physically exhausted but emotionally raw, as if the brief connection with Jonathan had awakened parts of herself she'd thought were permanently buried. Mrs. Patterson had recovered beautifully from her triple bypass, and her grateful family had sent enough flowers to turn Naomi's office into a greenhouse. But even their joy felt distant, filtered through the professional satisfaction of a job well done, rather than the deeper fulfillment she'd once found in healing. The hospital investigation was proceeding with bureaucratic thoroughness. Dr. Chen had assured her that Mr. Reed would be permanently banned from the premises, that appropriate consequences would follow from his completely unacceptable behavior. But instead of feeling vindicated, Naomi found herself questioning everything about that morning in the corridor. Had Jonathan's push been motivated by racist assumptions about her competence, or by the desperate grief of a father who'd never learned healthy ways to process loss? Had their conversation during the lockdown been genuine connection, or sophisticated manipulation by a businessman skilled at reading people's weaknesses? The uncertainty was eating at her in ways that clear-cut medical decisions never had. In surgery, she could trust her training, her instincts, her ability to read vital signs and anatomical structures. But in matters of the heart, in questions of human motivation and the possibility of redemption, she felt as lost as a first-year resident attempting brain surgery. "Dr. Williams." Her assistant knocked on the office door. "There's a delivery for you at the front desk. Something unusual." Naomi looked up from patient charts, grateful for any distraction from the endless loop of second-guessing that had dominated her thoughts. Unusual how? "Well, it's not flowers or a gift basket. I think you should just see for yourself." Curious despite her exhaustion, Naomi made her way to the hospital's main reception area, where a small crowd had gathered around the front desk. As she approached, she could see what had captured everyone's attention: a glass terrarium, exquisitely crafted, containing what appeared to be a complete ecosystem of plants, soil, and butterflies. She breathed, recognizing the delicate orange and black wings of monarchs moving gracefully among the flowering plants. The receptionist looked up with barely concealed excitement. "Dr. Williams, this arrived about an hour ago, along with this note." She handed over a small card, sealed in an envelope bearing Naomi's name in careful handwriting. With trembling fingers, Naomi opened the envelope and read, "Dr. Williams, David's butterfly cocoon that he was watching, the one that was supposed to emerge the night he died. I hope you don't mind that I took the liberty of finding out what happened to it. The new owners of your old house said it had emerged into a monarch butterfly the day after the funeral, and they'd been maintaining the garden as a small memorial. This terrarium contains descendants of those same butterflies, along with the native plants David would have loved to study. It's not meant to replace what you lost, or to buy forgiveness for what I did. It's meant to honor the scientific curiosity of a 6-year-old boy who believed in discoveries and new beginnings." Emma always said that butterflies were messages from people we love, reminders that beautiful transformations are possible even after the darkest times. I choose to believe she was right. If you can find any space in your heart to give us another chance, not as doctor and patient family, not as hospital staff and donor, but as two people who understand grief and maybe possibly understand each other, I'll be waiting in Riverside Park every evening at sunset for the next week. Section C by the Memorial Garden. I don't expect forgiveness, I just hope for the possibility of it. Respectfully, Jonathan Reed. P.S. Emma would have loved David's beetle collection. She always said scientists were just grown-ups who remembered how to ask the right questions. Naomi read the note twice, her hands shaking slightly as she tried to process the gesture. The terrarium wasn't just beautiful, it was thoughtful in ways that suggested genuine understanding rather than expensive gesture. Someone had researched her old house, contacted the current owners, learned about David's butterfly garden, and recreated it as a living memorial to her son's curiosity and wonder. The hospital staff around her were murmuring appreciatively about the gift, but Naomi barely heard them. She was thinking about Jonathan's words during the lockdown, about his willingness to share Emma's memory without trying to claim ownership of grief, about the way he'd listened to her stories of Michael and David with genuine interest rather than polite patience. Dr. Williams? Dr. Chen appeared at her elbow, his expression stern. I hope you're not considering responding to this. It's clearly an attempt to circumvent the hospital's investigation, possibly even witness tampering. The accusation should have made sense. It was exactly the kind of thing a wealthy businessman might do, use money and influence to manipulate the situation, to pressure her into dropping charges or providing favorable testimony. But looking at the terrarium, at the delicate ecosystem that someone had created as a tribute to her dead son's passion for science, Naomi found herself remembering not the entitled man who'd pushed her in the corridor, but the broken father who'd shared Emma's photograph with the reverence of someone displaying a sacred relic. What do you think? Can people truly change, or are first impressions usually the most accurate? How do we balance protecting ourselves with staying open to unexpected connections? Drop your thoughts below. Dr. Chen, she said quietly. What if we've got this wrong? Wrong how? His voice carried the sharp edge of administrative concern. Dr. Williams, this man physically assaulted you in front of multiple witnesses. The security footage is unambiguous. The physical act, yes. But what if the motivation was more complicated than we assumed? What if grief can make people do things that don't represent who they really are? Dr. Chen's expression softened slightly, but his position remained firm. Naomi, I understand your compassion, but we can't excuse harassment just because someone has experienced loss. Half our patients and families are dealing with grief. That doesn't give them the right to mistreat our staff. He was right, logically and professionally. The hospital had policies for good reason, and those policies existed to protect people like her from people like Jonathan Reed. But policies couldn't account for the complexity of human motivation, for the possibility that sometimes the worst first impressions preceded the most important relationships. Naomi looked at the terrarium again, at the monarchs moving gracefully among plants that had been chosen specifically to honor David's memory. It was the gesture of someone who'd paid attention during their conversation, someone who'd understood that her son's scientific curiosity was sacred territory that deserved respect rather than manipulation. I need to think, she told Dr. Chen. I need some time to process this. Dr. Williams, I strongly advise against any contact with Mr. Reed until the investigation is complete. Whatever you're feeling right now, don't let sentiment cloud your judgment. But as Naomi carried the terrarium back to her office, she realized that sentiment wasn't clouding her judgment, it was clarifying it. For 3 days she'd been trying to convince herself that her connection with Jonathan had been imaginary, that his grief had been performed, that his understanding of her loss had been calculated manipulation. The terrarium suggested otherwise. It suggested someone who'd spent considerable time and effort creating something beautiful and meaningful, not to buy forgiveness but to honor memory. It suggested someone who understood that healing required more than policy compliance and professional distance. That evening, Naomi drove past Riverside Park on her way home from the hospital. She could see Section C from the road, the memorial garden where families came to remember loved ones, where benches overlooked a small pond that reflected the sunset like scattered gold. She could see a solitary figure sitting on one of the benches, shoulders bent in a posture she recognized as the physical manifestation of hope struggling against despair. Jonathan Reed, waiting for a second chance he had no right to expect, but was brave enough to ask for anyway. Naomi drove past without stopping. But she drove past slowly, and part of her, the part that had been dormant for 7 years, the part that remembered what it felt like to believe in second chances and unexpected grace, whispered that maybe courage wasn't about making the safe choice. Maybe courage was about choosing connection over protection, vulnerability over safety, the terrifying possibility of love over the familiar comfort of isolation. Emma had believed in messages from butterflies and the magic of transformation. David had believed in discovery and the importance of asking the right questions. The question now was whether two adults who'd forgotten how to believe in anything could find the faith to believe in each other. The fifth evening found Jonathan still sitting on the memorial garden bench, watching the sun paint the pond in shades of amber and rose. He'd been there every day at sunset, as promised, though his faith in the gesture was wearing thin. Naomi had driven past twice. He'd seen her silver sedan slow down as it passed the park entrance, but she hadn't stopped, and he was beginning to accept that she never would. Emma's voice seemed to whisper in the evening breeze. "Sometimes the best gifts are the ones people need time to unwrap, Daddy." But time was running out. Tomorrow would be his 7th and final evening of waiting, and then he'd have to accept that some bridges, once burned, couldn't be rebuilt with good intentions and butterfly gardens. His phone buzzed with another message from his legal team. The hospital's investigation was concluding, and Dr. Chen was recommending formal harassment charges. His lawyers were confident they could negotiate a settlement, monetary compensation, a public apology, community service at medical charities, the kind of resolution that satisfied institutional requirements while avoiding messy trials that might damage both parties' reputations. But Jonathan no longer cared about protecting his reputation. The pharmaceutical merger was gone, his father had formally removed him from the company's board of directors, and his professional network was treating him like a man-shaped liability. The Reed family name, which had opened doors his entire life, now felt like a millstone around his neck. Yet sitting in the memorial garden, surrounded by the small monuments to love and loss that families had created for their departed, Jonathan felt more at peace than he had in years. The external structures of his life were crumbling, but something else was being built in their place, something more honest, more vulnerable, more aligned with the father Emma would have wanted him to become. A jogger passed by, followed by an elderly woman walking a small dog that immediately began investigating the base of Jonathan's bench. The dog's owner smiled apologetically as she tugged on the leash. "Sorry, Dr. Whiskers here thinks every bench is his personal territory." "Dr. Whiskers?" Jonathan asked, the name triggering a memory so sudden and sharp it took his breath away. "I know, silly name for a dog, right? My granddaughter chose it. She said he looked like he could grow up to be a veterinarian." Emma's goldfish from the carnival. The same impossible name, the same 8-year-old logic about animals and their professional potential. Jonathan stared at the small terrier, whose tail was wagging with unreasonable optimism despite being surrounded by strangers. "She sounds like a smart granddaughter," he managed. "Oh, she is. 8 years old and already planning to be a pediatric surgeon. Says she wants to fix kids like the nice people fixed her after she broke her arm last year." The woman's face glowed with grandmotherly pride. "Kids that age, they still believe anything is possible, don't they?" Jonathan nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in his throat. The woman continued on with Dr. Whiskers, but their brief interaction felt like a message from Emma herself, a reminder that 8-year-old wisdom about healing and hope and the possibility of transformation deserved to be taken seriously, even by adults who'd forgotten how to believe. As the sun began to set, painting the memorial garden in the golden light Emma had always called magic hour, Jonathan heard footsteps on the gravel path behind him. He didn't turn around, couldn't bear the disappointment if it was just another jogger or dog walker passing through. But then a familiar voice said quietly, "Is there room on that bench for someone who's spent the last 5 days being a coward?" Jonathan's heart stopped, then started again with a rhythm that felt like resurrection. He turned slowly, afraid that movement might break whatever spell had brought Naomi to the memorial garden, had convinced her to give them another chance at finding each other. She stood 3 feet away, still wearing her scrubs from the hospital, her hair pulled back in the practical ponytail of someone who'd come directly from saving lives. In her hands, she carried a small potted plant, something with delicate white flowers that seemed to glow in the evening light. "There's room," Jonathan said, his voice rough with 5 days of hope deferred. "There's always room." Naomi sat down beside him, not too close, but close enough that he could smell the faint antiseptic scent that clung to all medical personnel, the clean smell of someone who spent their days fighting death, and usually winning. "The terrarium is beautiful," she said, looking out at the pond rather than at him. David would have spent hours studying the ecosystem, cataloging the plant species, tracking the butterflies' feeding patterns. I hoped it would honor his memory properly," Jonathan said. "I had help from a lepidopterist at the Natural History Museum. She said monarchs represent transformation and renewal in almost every culture." "They do." Naomi's voice was soft, distant. "Michael used to tell David that butterflies were proof that beautiful things could emerge from darkness, that sometimes you had to trust the process even when you couldn't see what you were becoming." They sat in companionable silence, watching the sun sink lower toward the horizon. Other visitors to the memorial garden moved quietly among the small monuments, leaving flowers, lighting candles, whispering words meant for ears that could no longer hear them. "I've been thinking about what you said," Naomi said finally, "about Emma believing we needed to find each other, about miracles and connections, and whether 2 broken people can help each other heal." Jonathan waited, afraid that speaking might tip the conversation in directions he couldn't control. "I think maybe I've been hiding in my surgical schedule, the same way you've been hiding in your business empire," she continued. "Using work as a way to avoid dealing with the real damage, the places inside us that never properly healed." "The hospital investigation," Jonathan said. "Dr. Chen? The charges? I understand if that changes things, if the institutional pressure makes this impossible." Naomi turned to look at him directly for the first time since sitting down. "I withdrew my cooperation with the investigation yesterday. Told Dr. Chen that I didn't want to pursue formal charges, that I believed the incident was a misunderstanding born from grief rather than malicious intent." Jonathan felt something unclench in his chest, a knot of anxiety he'd carried for 5 days finally beginning to loosen. What did he say? That I was making a mistake. That wealthy men like you think their money gives them permission to treat people however they want, and that my forgiveness would only enable future bad behavior. She paused, her fingers tracing the rim of the pot she held. "He's not wrong about the power dynamics, about the ways privilege can blind people to their own behavior. But," Jonathan asked, hearing the hesitation in her voice, "but I also think trauma can make us do things that don't represent who we really are. And I think," she paused, seeming to gather courage for whatever came next, "I think maybe I recognize something in you that I've been trying to suppress in myself." "What's that?" "Desperation," she said simply. "The kind of desperate grief that makes you push people away, even when pushing them away is the last thing you actually want to do." Jonathan understood immediately. "You've been pushing people away too." "For 7 years." Naomi's admission came out like a confession. Medical colleagues who wanted to be friends, neighbors who invited me for dinner, men who asked me on dates. I told myself it was about protecting my professional focus, but really it was about protecting myself from caring about anyone I might lose. And now? Naomi held up the potted plant, its white flowers catching the last rays of sunlight. This is jasmine. It's what Michael planted in our backyard the spring before David was born, because he'd read that the scent could help babies sleep. After they died, I couldn't stand the smell. It reminded me of everything I'd lost. She set the pot on the bench between them, a small bridge spanning the space that separated their grief. But yesterday, when I was walking past the hospital garden, I smelled jasmine blooming, and instead of running away, I stood there and remembered the good parts. Michael reading pregnancy books and taking notes like he was studying for finals. David as a toddler, falling asleep in his crib while jasmine scent drifted through the window. Memory without devastation, Jonathan said, understanding the breakthrough she was describing. Yes. And I realized that maybe I've been so afraid of losing people that I forgot how to find them, how to let them find me. The sun was almost touching the horizon now, turning the memorial garden into something that belonged more in a fairy tale than in the middle of a busy city. Around them, candles began to flicker to life as evening visitors honored their departed loved ones with light. I brought something too, Jonathan said, pulling a small object from his jacket pocket. It was a wooden butterfly, painted in bright colors with Emma's childish artistry still visible in the uneven brushstrokes. Emma made this in art class a few weeks before the accident. It's been sitting in a box in my closet for 7 years because I couldn't bear to look at it. He held the painted butterfly up to catch the fading light, its cheerful colors a stark contrast to the solemnity of the memorial garden. She told me it was meant to be a refrigerator magnet, something to make me smile when I was getting my morning coffee and thinking about work problems. I never put it on the refrigerator because after she died, I couldn't imagine ever smiling at something so simple again. Naomi reached out tentatively, touching the wooden butterfly with one finger. It's beautiful. Very Emma. Very Emma, Jonathan agreed. Bright and optimistic and absolutely convinced that a homemade butterfly could solve any problem if you just believed in it hard enough. They sat quietly, sharing the small talismans of their grief, jasmine for Naomi, a painted butterfly for Jonathan, both of them learning that memory could be a bridge rather than a wall. What happens now? Naomi asked as the sun disappeared behind the trees, leaving the memorial garden bathed in the gentle glow of twilight. I don't know, Jonathan admitted. I've never been in a situation where the most important relationship in my life began with me behaving like someone I don't want to be. But you're not that person now, Naomi said. The man who pushed me in the hospital corridor was drowning in grief and didn't know how to ask for help. The man sitting next to me brought butterflies to honor my dead son and has spent 5 evenings waiting for a second chance he had no right to expect. People can change? Jonathan asked, the question carrying 7 years of hope he'd been afraid to voice. People can heal, Naomi corrected gently, especially when they don't try to heal alone. The first stars were beginning to appear, and the memorial garden had transformed into something magical, a place where love persisted beyond death, where hope could survive even the darkest losses. Dr. Williams, Jonathan said formally, then corrected himself. Naomi, would you like to have dinner with me? Somewhere quiet where we can talk about Emma and David and Michael, where we can figure out what it means to build something beautiful on the foundation of shared grief. Naomi smiled, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her since the lockdown brought them together. I'd like that very much. But Jonathan. Yes? Next time you're running late for a meeting and I'm in your way, just say excuse me like a normal person. Jonathan laughed, the sound surprising them both with its genuineness. Deal. And next time I'm grieving so hard I can't think straight, I'll try to remember that pushing people away only works if they don't understand why you're doing it. Deal. Naomi agreed. They stood together gathering their small memorial tokens, jasmine and painted butterflies, the physical representations of love that had survived loss. As they walked toward the park entrance, Jonathan felt Emma's presence in the evening breeze, felt her approval of this woman who understood that healing was possible, even after the darkest transformations. Behind them, candles flickered in the memorial garden like earthbound stars, small lights of remembrance that proved love could persist beyond death, that hope could survive even the most devastating losses. "There's something else," Naomi said as they reached her car. "The terrarium you sent? I've been thinking about expanding it, maybe creating a whole butterfly garden at the hospital. A place where families waiting for surgery could find some peace, where children could learn about transformation and renewal." "The Emma and David Memorial Garden," Jonathan suggested. "The Emma and David Memorial Garden," Naomi agreed. "A place where beautiful things can emerge from darkness." 6 months later, the butterfly garden at St. Mary's Hospital would be featured in medical journals as an innovative approach to patient family support, a place where grief and hope coexisted in careful balance. Naomi and Jonathan would work together on the project, their collaboration blossoming into something neither had dared to imagine during those first painful moments in a hospital corridor. But that evening in Riverside Park, they were just two people who'd found each other, at exactly the moment they'd both stopped believing in second chances, two hearts that had learned to beat in sync after years of struggling alone. Emma would have said it was magic. David would have called it scientific proof that beautiful transformations were always possible. What do you think about second chances, and the possibility of healing together after individual trauma? Have you ever experienced a connection that began badly but grew into something beautiful? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. And in the deepening twilight, surrounded by monuments to love that had survived death, Jonathan Reed and Dr. Naomi Williams discovered that sometimes the most important miracles were the ones that happened not in spite of our brokenness, but because of our courage to let someone else help us heal. The butterfly garden would be their gift to Emma and David, their promise that love in all its forms was the only force powerful enough to transform darkness into light.
If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one. Thank you for watching this story to the end.